Well, good evening, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. Just double checking everything and making sure everything is live. I hope you all are doing great on this beautiful evening. I've got to make sure I send everything, set it up, and make sure everybody can see everything and that it's all going to where it needs to go. I hope you all are doing well. It is a beautiful day here in Columbus, Ohio, and my hope is that wherever you are, that it's also whether it's a beautiful day. I hope it's been a wonderful day for you. All right, so we should have things up and running now. Make sure everything can be seen and heard. This is the downside of not having like a live producer with me when I do all this stuff. But at the same time, it's just the joys of doing live from my house and the rest. So, hope you are doing well. It has been a week, and in fact, this past week we've got some great reading. In fact, it's every week is a little bit different, including this week, which is changing up just a bit from past weeks. We've gone from some interesting concepts about miracles and debates, and then we had this an article written to this other person and the rest. And then tonight we switch it up to something a little bit different, which I still find fascinating. In fact, this one is kind of not a debate, but a discussion that took place quite a few years ago. So I want to give you some background on what that is. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Now, the chapter is called Answers to Questions on Christianity. That's the way that this is kind of portrayed. But the reality is that it would be a better portrayed as the one man brains trust, as that's what it was called. In fact, the one man brain trust was held on April 18th, 1944, at the Electric and Musical Industries Limited, also known as the EMI factory in Hayes, Middlesex, and where a notable event took place at that time, especially since this is at the height of World War II, where C.S. Lewis, who was already in this day a renowned author and scholar, engaged directly with factory workers to discuss questions related to Christianity in modern industry. Now, this is fascinating to me because we often think of either Lewis or other theologians or scholars like that they're kind of devoid of the real life discussions or the things going on in culture. In fact, Lewis was fairly connected in on these types of discussions all the time. One of the blessings about working up here is I get to work alongside men like Greg Tidwell and Clay Brown and Landon Wright. And about once or twice a year, we host an event at our church called Contemporary Concerns. And so we've covered lots of different topics over the last couple of years, from critical race theory to misinformation, disinformation. And people might actually wonder, why is a church doing this? It's addressing cultural trends, cultural issues that are coming about because of the situations at hand. In this case, this event was part of a broader wartime effort to boost morale and to foster intellectual engagement among workers contributing to the British war effort. Even Mere Christianity was originally not a book. It was three or four separate radio addresses, depending on how you break it down, radio addresses to give people hope and highlight Christianity as it was for the community. And here's another situation. Now, this chapter in of itself, um, some believe it was recorded, and then others will actually note that it was transcribed by someone. So these answers that are given are transcribed. Then they were sent to Lewis, who made a few changes or may have added a few new words or added little things along, and then sent it back, which is just fascinating. Because so this wasn't, I sat down and wrote this out. This is a live Q&A. And you do see that even in today's world. Now, you don't see this as much in a theological sense, but you do see this happening quite a bit on campuses across the United States. I'm thinking about some of the political events we've seen over the few years with, I think it's TVP USA, things like that, where they'll come in and do like live Q&As with individuals. You can come up, grab a mic, ask a question. Same premise. We did something like this recently. It was about 2 years ago, called 12 Questions, where people were able to ask questions. We took the top 12 genre of questions. We answered those through a live stream. It wasn't live in the sense people asking questions from the audience, but we did take people's questions and tried our best to answer from there. So the background and the context of this continues. So the location and the organizer, this event took place at the EMI factory in Hayes, Middlesex, which was a significant industrial hub during World War II. It was involved in manufacturing critical war materials, radar components, and was later, and this is one of my favorite little things, and this is a kind of a shout out to my dad too, famous for its Abbey Road recording studios where the Beatles recorded their music. So from there, the format was called the One Man Brain Trust, was inspired though by a popular BBC radio program called The Brains Trust, where a panel of intellectuals answered questions from the public. So people would call in, ask questions, and they would have a group of people that were, I don't know, the smarter people were answering the questions. In this case, C.S. Lewis served as the sole respondent, fielding questions from factory workers, which gave the event its unique kind of one man designation. So instead of the Brains Trust, it's the One Man Brains Trust. So that's why also I think it's Brains Trust on that too. So the purpose was aimed to address spiritual and philosophical concerns of workers, particularly in the context of the industrial labor and the ongoing war. It provided kind of a platform for workers to engage with complex theological and practical questions, which Lewis, offering insights as he did, grounded in the Christian worldview. Now, the introduction, this is how it kind of started. So Lewis opened the event with a brief statement on Christianity and modern industry. In fact, I'll note this. He acknowledged his lack of expertise in industrial matters. In fact, he does quite a bit more than that, emphasizing that Christianity does not replace technical knowledge, but provides just moral and spiritual guidance. He uses an analogy. Just as Christianity instructs to feed the hungry without teaching cookery, it offers principles for life without dictating industrial solutions. In fact, when I first started reading this years ago, I remember thinking, boy, this is an odd kind of discussion in that time, but it would have been so on point for what they were dealing with in their lives in that moment. So I think that's important for us to acknowledge and understand that. So the approach to the questions. Lewis was known for providing concise and thoughtful answers, often addressing profound theological issues with clarity suitable for a lay audience. His responses reflected his ability to connect with Christian doctrine with everyday concerns, making complex ideas accessible to factory workers. Now, I can say that for us in our modern thing, the idea of experts on anything, we're a very skeptical society now, and probably rightfully so in light of how many people claim expertise. And I would say there's a lot of people who know a lot of things, but they're functionally um, they're either incredibly ideological, and I don't mean that in a positive way, I mean that in a negative way, or they're only experts in who they are, as opposed to who they really should be. And so being the experts, I'm not really sure it is what it really meant to be, or what it should be in our modern context. In this day, though, Lewis was an Oxford Don, and so it should be of no surprise to any of us that he was the one, kind of the standout that everybody knows, everybody loved, and everybody wanted to see and be part of, and hear from him and hear his answers. So this would have attracted quite of a crowd. So in the wartime context, the event occurred during a critical period of World War II, just months before the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. The MI factory was a key contributor, as I said, to the war effort, and such events helped sustain worker morale. Now, the factory itself faced tragedy later that year. So this is in April, and this is now in July, where 37 employees and 56 others were injured in a bombing directly. So just keep that in mind. So it's not that they weren't, life and death was very much on the forefront of everything that was happening around them. So Lewis's outreach from this, and the significance of it, is this event kind of exemplified Lewis's constant wartime efforts to communicate Christian ideas to diverse audiences. His ability to engage with factory workers, many of whom might not have had any formal theological education, underscored his skill as a communicator and his commitment to making Christianity relevant to all walks of life. So beyond mere Christianity, here he is even hosting public events with workers to both encourage and educate along the way. From a cultural impact, the One Man Brains Trust reflects kind of the era's interest in intellectual and spiritual discourse. Even amidst the pressures of war, it also highlights the MI's role as a community hub. Manufacturing and the rest was at its height in this moment, especially to sustain the war efforts. Their output was both cultural and intellectual, and the engagement came from that. So let's dive into the actual, I think there's 17 questions that we'll get a chance to look at this evening. So it starts off, and just one note this: these are shorthand notes were made, and a typescript was sent to Lewis after the event. He revised it a little, and it was printed in 1944. Mr. H.W. Bowen was the question master. And so this was kind of an open debate, open situation, I guess, from there. So he starts off by saying this: I have been asked to open with a few words on Christianity and modern industry. Now, modern industry is a subject of which I know nothing at all. And I do love that he just kind of, I know nothing at all about this. But for the very reason, it may illustrate what Christianity, in my opinion, does and does not do. Christianity does not replace the technical. When it tells you to feed the hungry, it doesn't give you lessons in cookery. If you want to learn that, you must go to a cook rather than a Christian. If you are not a professional economist and have no experience of industry, simply being a Christian won't give you the answer to industrial problems. My own idea is that modern industry is a radically hopeless system. You can improve wages, hours, conditions, etc., but all that doesn't cure the deepest trouble, i.e., the numbers of people who all kept all their lives doing dull repetition work which gives no full play to their faculties. Now, part of me wants to think that this is a little tongue-in-cheek. This is a little humorous, maybe a little. This wasn't intended as a slight. That instead this might have been the people who are in the doldrums of repetitive building and machine work and shop work and so forth every day of their lives. But there may have just been, I feel for you for having to do all of these things because your faculties could deal with so much more than this. How that is to be overcome, I do not know. If a single country abandoned the system, it would merely fall a prey to the other countries which hadn't abandoned it. I don't know the solution. That is not the kind of thing Christianity teaches a person like me. Let's now carry on with the questions. Now, this has got to be probably one of the shortest introductions ever to what would have been a Q&A, but he wasn't about to go into a soliloquy or a diatribe. He just kind of went, yep, don't know much about industry in and of itself. However, that's not what Christianity is all about. So let's move on to the first question, and he moves on. So, question 1, and I will note as you follow along, you'll see question 1. Sometimes there is follow up. You'll see voice, which means somebody from the audience is following up or saying something else. And so I've tried to break that down so you will know who's speaking at different times. Christians are taught to love their neighbors. How, therefore, can they justify their attitude of supporting the war? Now, I'll be honest with you. When I first saw this, I was like, this was the first question? Whew, boy, they went straight into the deep end of the pool pretty quickly with this one. And I'll be honest with you, this is probably Lewis's answer that surprises most people. Even in today's world, this would surprise a few. But I really hope, and I hope you'll engage with what the thought process of what he says here is. You are told to love your neighbor as yourself. How do you love yourself? When I look into my own mind, I find that I do not love myself by thinking myself a dear old chap or having affectionate feelings. I do not think that I love myself because I am particularly good, but just because I am myself, and quite apart from my character. I might detest something which I have done, nevertheless I do not cease to love myself. In other words, that definite distinction that Christians make between hating sin and loving the sinner is one that you have been making in your own case since you were born. You dislike what you have done, but you don't cease to love yourself. You may even think that you ought to be hanged. You may even think that you ought to go to the police and own up and be hanged. Love is not affectionate feeling, but a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good as far as it can be obtained. It seems to me, therefore, that when the worst comes to the worst, if you cannot restrain a man by any method except by trying to kill him, then a Christian must do so. That is my answer. But I may be wrong. It is very difficult to answer, of course. Now, you have to understand that Lewis is coming from having fought in the First World War, having lost faith during the First World War, coming through that, calling himself the most reluctant convert in all of London, to then finding himself a Christian, and now the war of all wars is ongoing at its height. And this answer of loving his neighbor, and this isn't just the way we're throwing that around today, but specifically even in this moment, he notes, it seems to me, therefore, that when the worst comes to the worst, if you cannot restrain a man by any method except by trying to kill him, then a Christian must do that. That is my answer. But I do love this next part, but I may be wrong. It is very difficult to answer, of course, because so often we like to make definitive statements, definitive answers. And and we have quite a few today that would say it is inherently wrong to kill anyone. And there are some who are very judicious about the words that they use. In fact, I try to be. There is a difference in this, for example, in the scriptures between do not murder and do not kill. We see that all throughout the Old Testament. We see that even in the New Testament, that there is distinctions made along the way. But in this very specific moment, he was addressing the reality of this very deep, meaningful question that would have been straight into the deep end of the pool. How can you love your neighbor and support the war? And his answer was probably not what most were expecting, at times from an academic, even, but from someone who simply said um, that mankind, in of itself, often chooses things that go against him. And when push comes to shove, if there is no other method except to kill, to whether it's to save a life, whether it's to love others. In fact, so often we don't think of future victims of those when we call on people to love the neighbor, when we're not thinking about all the ones that may be saved in the future if the evil is not stopped or restrained in those ways. Now, in no way do I desire, in fact, I have no desire in my life to ever take someone's life, not by any stretch of the imagination. It is my hope that I'd be willing to give my life prior to that moment. But at the same time, it's one of those things that I have come to understand, that there's a deeper conversation to be had, and that there is real evil in this world, and real evil must be stopped. And the methodology of that is at times not nearly as black and white as we like to make it overall. So then he goes to question number 2. Supposing a factoring worker asked you, "How can I find God?" How would you reply? I don't see how the problem would be different for a factory worker than for anyone else. The primary thing about any man is that he is a human being, sharing all the ordinary human temptations and assets. What is the special problem about the factory worker? But perhaps it is worth saying this: Christianity really does do two things about conditions here and now in this world. It tries to make them as good as possible, i.e., to reform them, but also it fortifies you against them insofar as they remain bad. If what was in the questioner's mind was this problem of repetition work, then the factory worker's difficulty is the same as any other man who confronted with any sorrow or difficulty. People will find God if they consciously seek from him the right attitude toward all unpleasant things, if that is the point of the question. And so he's kind of reading into the question that they're why would you ask this question this way? What would be different between a factory worker asking this question and just anybody else asking this question? And he keeps going back to this idea. Maybe it's the fact that you have to do stuff over and over again that you just don't like. Maybe that would be a different thing. You know, maybe, well, people will find God even if they consciously seek from him the right attitude towards all unpleasant things, including making or building the same things over and over again in a factory. So he's kind of trying to clarify the question in a way. Question number 3. Will you please say how you would define a practicing Christian? Are there any other varieties? Now, this is a fascinating answer. Certainly, there are a great many other varieties. It depends, of course, on what you mean by practicing Christian. If you mean one who has practiced Christianity in every respect at every moment of his life, then there is only one on record: Christ himself. I love that answer, by the way. In that sense, there are no practicing Christians, but only Christians who, in varying degrees, try to practice it and fail in varying degrees and then start again. A perfect practice of Christianity would, of course, consist in a perfect imitation of the life of Christ. I mean, insofar as it was applicable into one's own particular circumstance. Not in an idiotic sense. It doesn't mean that every Christian should grow a beard or be a bachelor or become a traveling preacher. Um, it means that every single act and feeling, every experience, whether pleasant or unpleasant, must be referred to God. It means looking at everything as something that comes from him, and always looking to him and asking his will first and saying, "How would he wish me to deal with this?" A kind of picture or pattern, in a very remote way, of the relation between the perfect Christian and his God would be the relation of the good dog to its master. This is only a very imperfect picture, though, because the dog hasn't reason like its master. Whereas we do share in God's reason, even if in an imperfect and interrupted way. Interrupted because we don't think rationally for very long at a time. It's too tiring. And we haven't information to understand things fully, and our intelligence itself has certain limitations. In that way, we are more like God than the dog is like us, though. Of course, there are other ways in which the dog is more like us than we are like God. It is only an illustration. Now, I'll be honest with you, this entire little illustration of the God and the dog and the rest and going back and forth, I'm almost positive that the things in brackets were added later on where he's trying to clarify. So It's happened to me before. I think it's happened to a lot of people where you start an illustration, you're like, I like this illustration. Later on, you're like, well, there's probably a lot of caveats about how this illustration doesn't work. I find that Lewis kind of talks himself into this situation here, but the overall premise stands. In fact, I love the opening part about if you're talking about perfect Christianity. In fact, it's what I would say to people when they say, so many Christians have let me down, and I'm going, I know, but Jesus never has. Christians will let you down. They're going to fail you. I'm going to fail you. I'm going to mess up. There's going to be times where I need to clarify things I said or things that I did. All of those types of things are there. And we have to stop acting like that's the standard. Like perfection is our standard. It's never been the standard. Jesus has always been what we are ascribing to. But if we could live out perfect lives and without any sin, then we wouldn't have needed Jesus. And that we know to be false. And so, with that in mind, we just do the best that we can every day. We get up, and our prayer consistently is that we are maybe just not the people we were yesterday, maybe just a little bit more on the right road. And when we fall down, we get back up consistently. Question 4. What justification on ethical grounds and on the grounds of social expediency exists for the church's attitude towards venereal disease and prophylaxis and publicity in connection with it? Now, I'll be honest, this is probably one of those things that would have felt like for Lewis going, I'm sorry, what are we talking about? Because you'll see his answer. I need further advice on that question, and then perhaps I can answer it. Can the questioner say which church he has in mind? And the voice comes from the audience. It says, the church concerned is the Church of England, and its attitude, though not written, is implicit in that it has more or less banned all publicity in connection with prophylactic methods of combating venereal disease. The view of some is that moral punishment should not be avoided. So apparently, going around at that time, there seemed to have been a teaching, as prescribed by this individual, that the Church of England was basically saying, you're not supposed to use prophylaxis or condoms or something of that nature because venereal diseases was punishment for fornication. That was the premise, at least as it was being taught. Lewis is going to kind of object to that. He says, I haven't myself met any clergyman of the Church of England who held that view, and I don't hold it myself. There are obvious objections to it. After all, it isn't only venereal disease that can be regarded as a punishment for bad conduct. Indigestion in old age might be the result of overeating in an earlier life. But no one objects to advertisement for Beecham's pills, which, by the way, were for indigestion. I, at any rate, strongly dissent from the view you've mentioned. So basically says, I don't know of anybody who holds that view, especially in the Church of England. And you got to remember, while Lewis was Church of England, he didn't represent. He wasn't a theologian. He wasn't. He saw himself as a layman, not as a clergyman. And so he would never speak for the church. But he said, I don't know of anybody who holds that view, nor do I know the church that's teaching that. So question 5. He kind of moves on quickly from that one, from what it seems. Many people feel resentful or unhappy because they think they are the target of unjust fate. These feelings are stimulated by bereavement, illness, deranged domestic or working conditions, or the observation of suffering in others. What is the Christian view of this problem? I think this kind of may come into, it's kind of a woe is me, and the attitude of negativity that some may feel, especially when you look at deranged domestic or working conditions. So think height of World War II, lots of issues. The Christian view is that men were created to be in a certain relationship to God. And here's where he probably adds in a caveat later on. If we are in that relation to him, the right relation to one another will follow inevitably. Christ said it was difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, referring no doubt to riches in the ordinary sense. But I think it really covers riches in every sense. Good fortune, health, popularity, and all the things one wants to have. All these things tend, just as money tends, to make you feel independent of God. Because if you have them, you are happy already and contented in this life. You don't want to turn away to anything more, and so you try to rest in a shadowy happiness as if it could last forever. But God wants to give you a real and eternal happiness. Consequently, he may have to take all these riches away from you. If he doesn't, you will go on relying on them. It sounds cruel, doesn't it? But I am beginning to find out that what people call the cruel doctrines are really the kindest ones in the long run. I used to think it was cruel doctrines to say that troubles and sorrows were punishments. But I find in practice that when you are in trouble, the moment you regard it as a punishment, it becomes easier to bear. If you think of this world as a place intended simply for our happiness, you find it quite intolerable. Think of it as a place of training and correction, and it's not so bad. Now, this is a fascinating analogy. I've often said before that um, we all make terrible gods in our own lives, mainly because nobody else realizes we're a god. You don't realize I'm a god, and so when everything doesn't go my way, the world doesn't make sense. Because if I'm the center of all things, then everything should go my way. And so many people live their lives in that way, and they never realize how damaging it actually is to their mindset because they don't realize this world is not about us, not in that way. So he continues on and says, imagine a set of people all living in the same building. Now, this is a fascinating argument, by the way. Half of them think it is a hotel, the other half think it is a prison. Those who think it a hotel might regard it as quite intolerable, and those who thought it was a prison might decide it was really surprisingly comfortable. So that what seems the ugly doctrine is one that comforts and strengthens you in the end. The people who try to hold an optimistic view of this world would become pessimists. The people who hold a pretty stern view of it become optimistic. Basically, he's getting to a point where he's saying, if you understand that this world is not about you, truly not about you, then when things go wrong, you'll understand, well, things go wrong in a broken world. If, however, you spend your entire life expecting everything to go right, and then the things will go wrong like they often do in the world, you will think it the worst place in the world, instead of it making perfect sense in a world of fallen nature and the sin of mankind. So this moves into our sixth question. I love that last question, by the way. In fact, that's one that if I'd encourage you to spend time thinking on that one. Materialists and some astronomers suggest that the solar planetary system and life as we know it was brought about by an accidental stellar collision. So this goes back to kind of the premise of not even the Big Bang Theory. And then they ask, what is the Christian view of this? It's that the world came about and the solar planetary system came about because two stars collided. Now, the problem with that is where the stars come from. So this is it was one of those starting points. If the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, then the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then all our present thoughts are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the thoughts of the materialists and astronomers as well as for anyone else's. But if their thoughts, i.e., of materialism and astronomy, are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give me a correct account of all other accidents. It's like expecting that the accidental shape taken by the splash when you upset a milk jug should give you a correct account of how the jug was made and why it was upset. So it basically says if you spill milk and you look down at the milk spilt and the what it looks like on the ground, there's no way you should know what the milk jug looks like in any way because it's completely random and it's an accident. So there's no way you should be able to go, well, we know a milk jug was hit specifically at this moment in time because of this and so forth from there. So that makes no sense at all. So he moves to question 7. Is it true that Christianity, especially the Protestant forms, tends to produce a gloomy, joyless condition of society, which is like a pain in the neck to most people? Now, I'll be honest, there has to be something deeper behind this, not just the question of the person. These are what we would call loaded questions. But Lewis answers it in a fascinating way, which seems to me that it's tied to the perspective of where people were coming from before. So from the 16th century, so whether it was a book or a thought process or a conversation that was happening here in the 20th century, I don't know, but there seems to be something because of how his answer comes about. I did some research, and I haven't found the answer I like yet that makes the most sense with all of this. But here's his answer. As to the distinction between Protestant and other forms of Christianity is very difficult to answer. I find by reading about the 16th century that people like Sir Thomas More, for whom I have a great respect, always regarded Martin Luther's doctrines not as gloomy thinking, but as wishful thinking. I doubt whether we can make a distinction between Protestant and other forms in this respect. Whether Protestantism is gloomy and whether Christianity at all produces gloominess, I find it very difficult to answer, as I have never lived in a completely non-Christian society, nor a completely Christian one. And I wasn't there in the 16th century and only have my knowledge from reading books. I think there is about the same amount of fun and gloom in all periods. The poems, novels, letters, etc. of every period all seem to show that. But again, I don't really know the answer. Of course, I wasn't there. So he seems to be ascribing it to a time and period, and it may have been that there was this concept of a height of Christianity at certain points. So maybe, as my father would know, the Renaissance period and the height of even Catholicism, we saw the pomp and circumstance today, for those of you who are watching after the fact, of the new pope being chosen today, the papal conclave breaking on all the rest, the first ever American pope, all of those things. And there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. And in the height of the Renaissance, there was this feeling of rejuvenation and novelty and newness, and faith was coming back alive again, coming out of the Dark Ages. So he may be referencing back the 16th, 15th century and so forth. And then talking about how Protestantism, basically, so from Martin Luther and the rest, has brought about only gloominess, as opposed to what was attached to the Catholic Church and the rest. I don't know. I'm speculating in many ways. He seems to not know the fullness of what was being asked too. I would easily make the argument that true Christianity and true faith is nothing but joy, but joy does not equate to happiness. It does not equate to all things being good. It's finding and choosing joy no matter the situation that you're in, no matter how things are going. And in some ways, that's why he says, I think there is about the same amount of fun and gloom in all periods of time, that there are good times and there are bad times across it all. Question 8. Is it true that Christians must be prepared to live a life of personal discomfort and self-sacrifice in order to qualify for pie in the sky? I love this. I didn't realize that thought process or that saying went back this far, but apparently it does. All people, whether Christian or not, must be prepared to live a life of discomfort. It is impossible to accept Christianity for the sake of finding comfort. But the Christian tries to lay himself open to the will of God, to do what God wants him to do. You don't know in advance whether God is going to set you to do something difficult or painful, or something that you will quite like. And some people are of heroic mold are disappointed when the job doled out to them turns out to be something quite nice. But you must be prepared for the unpleasant things and the discomforts. I don't mean fasting and things like that. They are a different matter. When you are training soldiers in maneuvers, you practice with blank ammunition because you would like them to have practice before meeting the real enemy. So we must practice in abstaining from pleasures which are not in themselves wicked. If you don't abstain from pleasure, you won't be good when the time comes along. It is purely a matter of practice. So this is where apparently the person kind of chimes in. Are not practices like fasting and self-denial borrowed from earlier, more primitive religions? Lewis answers, I can't say for certain which bits came into Christianity from earlier religions. An enormous amount did. I should find it hard to believe Christianity if that were not so. I can't believe that 999 religions were completely false and the remaining one true. In reality, Christianity is primarily the fulfillment of the Jewish religion, but also the fulfillment of what was vaguely hinted in all the religions at their best. What was vaguely seen in them all comes into focus in Christianity, just as God himself comes into focus by becoming a man. I take it that the speaker's remarks on earlier religions are based on evidence about modern savages. I don't think it is good evidence. Modern savages usually represent some decay in culture. You find them doing things which look as if they had a fairly civilized basis once, which they have forgotten. To assume that primitive man was exactly like the modern savage is unsound. Now, even the terminology modern savage and the rest, it might surprise people to know that even in the 21st century, there are still tribes in certain places in Amazon and I think near Sri Lanka. There's an island near Sri Lanka and the rest where people still live in what would be considered primitive savage. And I'm using that terminology not as a descriptor of the people, but in how it's been used historically. People without not just modern amenities, but without even iron. So many of them are still bow and arrow, things of that nature. Without clothing, without any of the modern amenities that are considered civilized. So they would be savage in light of civilized modern civilization. So the voice responds and asks kind of another clarifying from there. Could you say any more on how one discovers whether a task is laid on one by God or whether it comes in some other way? If we cannot distinguish between the pleasant and the unpleasant things, it is a complicated matter. Lewis answers, says, we are guided by the ordinary rules of moral behavior, which I think are more or less common to the human race and quite reasonable and demanded by the circumstances. I don't mean anything like sitting down or waiting for a supernatural vision. And then the voice pipes up again. We don't qualify for heaven by practice, but salvation is obtained at the cross. We do nothing to obtain it but follow Christ. We may have pain or tribulation, but nothing we do qualifies us for heaven but Christ. Now, Lewis is about to answer. Before I read his answer, I should note it would seem that there was somebody who has a deep faith and maybe even a bit of a theological training in the audience because this back and forth is different than the other questions that are being asked. The controversy about faith and works is one that has gone on for a very long time, and it is a highly technical matter. I personally rely on the paradoxical text, work out your own salvation, for it is God that worketh in you. It looks as if one sense we do nothing, and another case we do a damned lot. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, but you must have it in you before you can work it out. But I have no wish to go further into it, as it would interest no one but the Christian present, would it? And so he kind of fast forwards and goes, well, I'm kind of getting off track here on this little thing, because this would only interest the people who are already Christians, wouldn't it? So question 9. Would the application of Christian standards bring to an end or greatly reduce scientific and material progress? In other words, is it wrong for a Christian to be ambitious and strive for personal success? It is easiest to think of a simplified example. How would the application of Christianity affect anyone on a desert island? Would he be less likely to build a comfortable hut? The answer is no. There might come a particular moment, of course, when Christianity would tell him to bother less about the hut. An example, if he were in danger of coming to think that the hut was the most important thing in the universe. But there is no evidence that Christianity would prevent him from building it. Ambition. We must be careful what we mean by it. If it means the desire to get ahead of other people, which is what I think it does mean, then it is bad. If it means simply wanting to do a thing well, then it is good. It isn't wrong for an actor to want to act his part as well as it can be possibly be acted, but the wish to have his name in bigger type than the other actors is a bad one. And the voice answers, it's all right to be a general, but if it's one ambition to be a general, then you shouldn't become one. And then Lewis responds by saying, the mere event of becoming a general isn't either right or wrong in and of itself. What matters morally is your attitude towards it. So that's really what he's getting at to with this answer, is it matters what your attitude is for ambition. If you're just seeking money or fame or clout or the rest for your own gain, then it can and is wrong. However, if you're doing all those things that God might be glorified or that you might serve the people of your community and the rest, then it is good. The man we may be thinking about winning a war. He may be wanting to be a general because he honestly thinks he has a good plan and is glad of a chance to carry it out. That's all right. But if he is thinking, what can I get out of the job, or how can I get on the front page of the Illustrated News, then it is all wrong. And what we call ambition usually means the wish to be more conspicuous or more successful than someone else. It is in this competitive element that it is bad. It is perfectly reasonable to want to dance well or to look nice. But when the dominant wish is to dance better or look nicer than others, when you begin to feel that if the others dance as well as you or looked as nice as you, that would take all the fun out of it, then you are going wrong. So doing things for the right reason is really what he's getting at here. And now there's a voice that chimes up again. I was wondering how far we can ascribe to the work of the devil those very legitimate desires that we indulge in. Some people have a very sensitive conception of the presence of the devil. Others haven't. Is the devil as real as we think he is? That doesn't trouble some people since they have no desire to be good, but others are continually harassed by the old man himself. Lewis says no reference to the devil or devils is included in any Christian creeds. Now notice creeds there. And it is quite possible to be a Christian without believing in them. I do believe such beings exist, but that is my own affair. Supposing there to be such beings, the degree to which humans were conscious of their presence would presumably vary very much. And I will note, I do believe in angels and demons. I find them all throughout Scripture. Note Lewis is noting Christian creeds, not necessarily the Scriptures themselves. I mean, the more a man who was in the devil's power, the less he would be aware of it, or the principle that a man is still fairly sober as long as he knows he's drunk. It is the people who are fully awake and trying hard to be good who would be most aware of the devil. It is when you start arming against Hitler that you first realize your country is full of Nazi agents. And so here's a direct connection to World War II. Of course, they don't want you to believe in the devil. If the devil exists, the first aim is to give you an aesthetic, to put you off your guard. Only if that fails do you become aware of them. So the voice chimes up again from the audience. And I love this kind of back and forth. You get the feeling of the liveness of this all. Does Christianity retard scientific advancement? Or does it approve of those who help spiritually others who are on the road to perdition by scientifically removing the environmental causes of the trouble? Yes, in the abstract it is certainly so. At a particular moment, if most human beings are concentrating only on material improvements in the environment, it may be the duty of Christians to point out, and pretty loudly, that this isn't the only thing that matters. But as a general rule, it is in favor of all knowledge and all that will help the human race in any way. Question 10. The Bible was written thousands of years ago for people in a lower state of mental development than today. I love the starting point of this question, the assumption of we have arrived where we are, and we are better or more wise than the people long before us. And it's notable, this is not unusual for this time. We have people who do that today. We have, you go on TikTok, you go on Facebook and the rest, you will see over and over again people doing making this the same exact argument. Many portions seem preposterous in the light of modern knowledge. In view of this, should not the Bible be rewritten with the object of discarding the fabulous and reinterpreting the remainder? First of all, as to the people in a lower state of mental development, I am not so sure what lurks behind that. If it means that people 10,000 years ago didn't know a good many things that we know now, of course I agree. But if it means that there have been any advance in intelligence in that time, I believe there is no evidence for any such thing. The Bible can be divided into two parts, the Old and the New Testaments. The Old Testament contains fabulous elements. The New Testament consists mostly of teaching, not of narrative at all. But where it is narrative, it is, in my opinion, historical. As to the fabulous element in the Old Testament, I very much doubt if you would be wise to chuck it out. What you get is something coming gradually into focus. First, you get, scattered through the heathen religions all over the world, but still quite vague and mythical, the idea of a God who is killed and broken and then comes to life again. No one knows where he is supposed to have lived and died. He's not historical. Then you get the Old Testament. Religious ideas get a bit more focused. Everything is now connected with particular nation. And it comes still more into focus as it goes on. Jonah and the whale, Noah and his ark are fabulous. But the court history of King David is probably as reliable as the court history of Louis XIV. Then, in the New Testament, the thing really happens. The dying God really appears as an historical person living in a definite place and time. If we could sort out all the fabulous elements in the earlier stages and separate them from the historical ones, I think we might lose an essential part of the whole process. That is my own idea. So Lewis kind of backs up and uses a narrative way here of basically arguing that even other religions, and this is an argument I have made myself through the years, a little bit different than Lewis's, that Lewis argues that even through the years and through all of the other religions, that there are what we would call kernels of truth that can be found in many of them. There are religious ideas of love and faith and goodness and hope and the rest found in many different religions. His argument is that those little kernels of truth were meant to point people back to the eternal nature of God, to the complete truth, big T truth, if you will, of who God actually is. And he makes an argument that checking out the Bible and the Old Testament, all those things, those were just as historical as anything that we have today. And he brings it back to Jesus specifically. And he makes the argument that no, changing the Bible just to change the Bible, that would not be. I think we would lose an essential part of the whole process by doing something like that. Question 11. Which of the religions of the world gives to its followers the greatest happiness? Which of the religions of the world gives to its followers the greatest happiness? Now, you have to understand how Lewis thinks of happiness, okay? Happiness, and this is probably one of my favorite quotes of his, because this is so tongue-in-cheek off the top, but it's so perfect. While it lasts, the religion of worshiping oneself is the best. So here he goes. All right, well, if you're looking for happiness, well, worship yourself. You're going to love that one. You're going to make yourself happy when all you do is go after your own happiness. He says, I have an elderly acquaintance of about 80 who has lived a life of unbroken selfishness and self-admiration from the earliest years and is, more or less, I regret to say, one of the happiest men that I know. From the moral point of view, it is very difficult. I am not approaching the question from that angle. As you perhaps know, I haven't always been a Christian. I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port would do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. I am certain there must be a patent American article on the market which will suit you far better, but I can't give any advice on it. In a way, he dismisses the question as, why would you want that? Christianity isn't about happiness. It's not about the fleeting emotion that is happiness. It's more than that. Now, part of me wishes he had expanded on that and shown why Christianity is and does provide, though, joy through sorrow, joy through punishment, joy through God redirecting our lives in that way. But I do love that he actually says, as you perhaps know, I haven't always been a Christian. I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port would do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. And this distinction, I think, does help people, though, because people, so many people have been sold a version of Christianity that tells them that God is there to give them all the things of their desires and their wants and their heart, and that God is there to make them happy. And there is nothing at times, and I'll use this very carefully, more damning than selling people a false God, selling people a false aspect of who Jesus is and what Jesus does and the reason and what he provides and what Christianity provides through its teachings, than to provide this idea that God is going to give them whatever they want at any point in time. Question 12. Are there any unmistakable outward signs in a person surrendered to God? Would he be cantankerous? Would he smoke? I think of the advertisements for White Smiles toothpaste saying that it is best on the market. If they are true, it would follow that anyone starts using it would have better teeth. Anyone using it had better teeth than he would have if he weren't using it. But you can't test it in the case of one who has naturally bad teeth and uses it and compare him with a healthy Negro who had never used toothpaste at all. Now, it's important to know here even the terminologies that we would use here. This is the 1940s, and Lewis is not referencing this as a negative this way. He's directly referencing specifically, I think, from some of the readings I was doing on this, that from the 1940s and the rest, that Africa and the travel, we have to think, man, this is before the travel the way that we would travel the world. It was mostly done by train, and airplanes even at that time were very, they don't travel like people do today. They don't have videos the way we do have today. And so our perception of Africa and his perception of Africa, his perception of people from different places and continents and places of that nature, was what I would make a very easy argument that was very primitive in comparison to what we see and what we know now. People, in fact, today are inundated with knowledge of different groups and different peoples and the rest. And so it's important for us to understand the terminologies and how they uses this in light of what was known in that day. And so also this idea of the brushing the teeth, there's kind of a negative aspect where in Africa they wouldn't necessarily brush their teeth. I don't know if that was true in the 1940s, but it's one that Lewis makes as an argument here in and of itself, but also noting that using toothpaste or not, is kind of the analogy that he's using, the White Smiles for toothpaste. And this next part is where he kind of gets into a really kind of what I would call a better argument. Take the case of a sour old maid who is a Christian, but cantankerous. On the other hand, take some pleasant and popular fellow, but who has never been to church. Who knows how much more cantankerous the old maid might be if she were not a Christian, and how much more likable the nicer fellow might be if he were a Christian. You can't judge Christianity simply by comparing the product in these two people. You would need to know what kind of raw material Christ was working with in both cases. There are some people who are naturally more joyous than others. So, because the joy of their life is so evident, and you could say, well, they're a Christian, so it must be more from God. But then you meet somebody who is quiet and restrained, but they're also a Christian, but you say, well, they must not, God must not be working as much. Well, you don't know that. You're making a judgment based off as if every person was the same. And that's really his argument, that the idea that everyone must be the same or starts off as the same is the problem in and of itself. You don't know how they would have been if they hadn't been Christian or if they were. Instead, you leave that to God. As an illustration, let us take the case of industrialism. So now he's going to talk literally to them, these workers. Let us take two factories. Factory A with poor and inadequate plant, and Factory B with first-class modern plant. You can't judge by the outside. You must consider the plant and methods by which they are run. And considering the plant at Factory A, it may be a wonder if it does anything at all. And considering the new machinery at Factory B, it may be a wonder if it doesn't do better. So if you have one that looks shabby on the outside and one that looks good, well, the only way you can look at the outcome is what's on the inside. And what's on the inside, you might assume the one that plant that looks nicer might produce a better product, but you don't know that to be true. The one on the inside may have better results in and of itself. Question 13. What is your opinion about raffles within the plant? No matter how good the cause, which not infrequently is given less prominence than the alluring list of prizes. I love this. This is obvious. There must have been a raffle going on at the very time when this happened, kind of hit in the moment. So I think this is fascinating. Gambling ought never to be an important part of a man's life. If it is a way in which large sums of monies are transferred from person to person without doing any good, example, producing employment, goodwill, then it is a bad thing. If it is carried out on a small scale, I'm not sure that it is bad. I don't know much about it because it's about the only vice to which I have no temptation at all. And I think it is a risk to talk about things which are not in my own makeup because I don't understand them. If anyone comes to me asking to play bridge for money, I just say, "How much do you hope to win? Take it and go away." I do love this. He's like, "Well, of all the vices in the world, this is not one that I have. So I'm not sure I really have a very strong opinion on this. I feel like if it's a big thing and it could cause greed and so forth, yeah, it'd be bad. But on the small things, I don't have a problem with it." So then he moves to question 14. Many people are quite unable to understand the theological differences which have caused divisions in the Christian church. Do you consider that these differences are fundamental and in the time now ripe for reunion? The time is always ripe for reunion. Divisions between Christians are a sin and a scandal, and Christians ought at all times to be making contributions towards reunion, if it is only by their prayers. I am only a layman and a recent Christian. I do not know much about these things, but in all the things which I have written and thought, I have always stuck to traditional dogmatic positions. The result is that letters of agreement reach me from what are ordinarily regarded as the most different kind of Christians. For instance, I get letters from Jesuits, monks, nuns, and also from Quakers and Welsh dissenters, and so on. So it seems to me that the extremist elements in every church are nearest one another, and the liberal and broad minded people in each body could never be united at all. Now, this fascinating little note there at the end that the extremist elements, notice who he's kind of noting: Jesuits, monks, nuns, Quakers, Welsh dissenters. This would be considered the extremist elements because of their fact that they're divided, they're in different groups. But he's writing about the fact that he's speaking about the fact that they've written him in agreement on major Christian doctrines. But it is nearest the liberal and the broad minded people in each body could never be united at all because in their broad mindedness, either everyone gets accepted or no one does. In fact, if you are to draw a line where they do not, then you suddenly are on the outskirts. You are the dissenter. You are the one causing division, when in reality it is they who are drawing a line too. And so it's fascinating that he notes this. The world of dogmatic Christianity is a place in which thousands of people of quite different types keep on saying the same thing. And the world of broad-mindedness and watered-down religion in a world where a small number of people, all of the same type, say totally different things and change their minds every few minutes. We shall never get reunion from them. Question 15. I think that kind of wraps up what I was saying in essence. In the past, the church used various kinds of compulsion and attempts to force a particular brand of Christianity on the community. Given sufficient power, is there not a danger of this sort of thing happening again? Boy, that's kind of relevant to a lot of the conversations that are happening around our own culture today. Yes, I hear nasty rumors coming from Spain. Persecution is a temptation to which all men are exposed. I had a postcard signed MD saying that anyone who expressed and published his belief in the virgin birth should be stripped and hogged. That shows you how easily persecution of Christians by the non-Christians might come back. Of course, they wouldn't call it persecution. They'd call it compulsory re-education of the ideologically unfit or something like that. Just going to note, just think back 2020, 2021, any of the churches and the rest, compulsory re-education. Think about the transgender rights and think about LGBTQ plus and so forth. Think about where Canada is. There is a lot of reality to what was even being, what he talks about here in 1944, that we still deal with in modern day America in 2025. But of course, I have to admit that Christians themselves have been persecutors in the past. It was worse of them because they ought to have known better. They weren't worse in any other way. I detest every kind of religious compulsion. Only the other day I was writing an angry letter to The Spectator, I think that's a newspaper, about church parades in the Home Guard. So he's even giving his own personal things. And we shouldn't be forcing religion on anyone. I detest any kind of religious compulsion. Question 16. Is attendance at a place of worship or membership with a Christian community necessary to a Christian way of life? Oh man, boy, this is one that speaks, especially coming post-COVID for a lot of people. That's a question which I cannot answer. My own experience is that when I first became a Christian about 14 years ago, I thought that I could do it on my own by retiring to my rooms and reading theology, and I wouldn't go to the churches and gospel halls. And then later I found that it was the only way of flying your flag. And of course, I found that this meant being a target. It is extraordinary how inconvenient to your family it becomes for you to get up early to go to church. It doesn't matter so much if you get up early of anything for anything else, but if you get up early to go to church, it's very selfish of you and you upset the house. If there is anything in the teaching of the New Testament which is in the nature of a command, it is that you are obliged to take the sacrament, and you can't do it without going to church. So he's referencing the Lord's Supper there. I disliked very much their hymns, which I considered to be fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music. But as I went on, I saw the great merit of it. I came up against different people of quite different outlooks and different education, and then gradually my conceit just began peeling off. I love this narrative way in which he's telling him his own experience and why he ultimately said, I cannot answer that, but let me tell you why it mattered to me and how it changed and how I changed my view. I realized that the hymns, which were just sixth-rate music, were nevertheless being sung with devotion and benefit by an old saint in elastic side boots in the opposite pew. And then you realize that you aren't fit to clean those boots. It gets you out of your solitary conceit. It is not for me to lay down laws, as I am only a layman and I don't know much. While he's answering what he feels like he had to do, he's not saying everybody has to do this, but the reality is he's saying there are commands in which you must follow. And in fact, it doesn't matter if you like it or not. In fact, it should, hopefully, your conceit, much like it happened to him, would fall away. And then the last question. If it is true that one has only to want God enough in order to find him, how can I make myself want him enough to enable myself to find him? If you don't want God, why are you so anxious to want him? I think that in reality, the want is a real one, and I should say that this person has in fact found God, although it may not be fully recognized yet. We are not always aware of things at the time they happen. At any rate, what is more important is that God has found this person, and that is the main thing. A simple answer to a simple question. So, here we are at the end of it all. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate you all for being with us. Looking forward to next week. Hope you can join us. It's going to be fantastic. For those of you watching after the fact, let me know where you're tuning in from. Add your comments. I love keeping up with all the things that you guys are doing. I love the comments and everything. So grateful for everything that you mean to me and for being part of this rabbit hole study, and especially the study on God in the Dock. Looking forward to seeing you all hopefully next week. We'll see you then.